All right, sorry about that. Got cut off. Just a couple more points here. The Carolinas, South Carolina, started as a colony actually for some of the wealthier plantation owners in the Caribbean and Barbados, and that colony starts to grow and expand. This is the Carolinas were really like classic case of large scale plantation agriculture. As a result of that, you see large number of slaves shipped to Charlestown or Charleston, and that kind of became the slave distribution center, for lack of a better word, for the South. We're going to touch on this in a second, or Mr. Eskridge's, but one of the key components of colonization that we really need to drive home this point is that the colonies were not a colony, they were several different colonies. And depending on where you were living, your religion, economic practice, it could be very different. So Mr. Eskridge is going to touch on that right now.
All right, hey guys. So one of the things that we really want to focus on is that, as Mr. Vieira said, the difference between the colonies. So even though they're all distinct, even within these categories that we have created between northern, middle, and southern, they're all unique in their own way. And we're not going to see until after the 7 Years' War, so the 1760s, 1770s, so leading up to the American Revolution, that we're going to see colonists within all 13 colonies really try to create unity within the colonies. We will see different aspects that did unite them in certain ways, like their economies to an extent, religion, but for the most part, they're distinct in their political organization, their social structures, and their economies, and kind of just what they're able to produce and how they go about their life. So just starting with the northern colonies up here in New England, they're characterized by small farms, moderate industry. We're going to see the Industrial Revolution really take hold there later on. If you remember back from world history, because of the access to water, so they could create mills and things like that, we're going to see industry really take off in that northern region later on. They have government structures that are focused around town meetings. Typically, each town would have its own small municipal government in which many decisions were made for the community at large. They're in the north. They're also really religiously controlled. So if you remember, this is where the Puritans went, and so the Puritans have really strict rules about their communities, and we see with the example of the folks getting kicked out of Massachusetts and going to Rhode Island, like Anne Hutchinson. They're relatively intolerant if you go against them, right? Moving down south, or further south into the middle colonies, where we have New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These are characterized more by small farms, mild industry. They're ethnically blended, so we have a lot of people moving from Pennsylvania from various parts of Europe, seeking new opportunities that they don't have in Europe. They're a lot more tolerant of religion, as Mr. Vieira touched on. The Quakers were pretty much open to, whatever you believe, great, you do you, kind of to each his own. And as long as you weren't going out of your way to hurt anyone else, then you would be able to live your life as you wanted. Another thing that I wanted to mention, up in the north, we have a lot more rocky terrain, a lot more trees, a lot more timber, stuff like that. And as we move into the middle colonies, we're starting to get into more open spaces. So in the middle colonies, they're able to produce grain crops like wheat and barley and other things like that. And so that's going to shape the landscape as well. So these mid-sized farms, we have more dairies, we have more cows, sheep, those different aspects. Now that we move, and now moving further south down into Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then Georgia, which Georgia is added last as kind of a stronghold, kind of a buffer between the Spanish down in Florida and the English colonies. The South, as we've seen from the beginning of this course, with the planting of Jamestown, really circulated around California's gold, around Virginia's gold, and being tobacco. And so tobacco is one of the first of a handful of cash crops that are just produced in mass, just acres and acres and acres. And the primary goal of them is to produce basically luxury goods, tobacco, cotton later, and just other things. So these aren't foods that are being eaten, but they're just being sold for cash in order to make money. And so these are characterized by these real huge plantations that might go on for miles at some time. There's very little industry because the primary focus, economic driver, is the agriculture. They do have some county governments, but again, these counties are typically pretty large. And so, for the most part, in the South, people kind of govern themselves for the most part. They are brought together, maybe on Sundays for church or other services like that. But certainly, we don't have the tight knit communities that we see in the middle and the northern colonies. And education is going to play a role in that later. We're going to see how education plays out in that. So I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Vieira.
All right. So again, a couple of maps to help you. This you could kind of see even the way that the religion differed depending on what part of the colonies you were in. So thank you, Mr. Escard, for touching on that. We'll finish up here in a couple minutes with two more major events during the chapter during this time period. So the Salem witch trials, this may be something that you are familiar with from horror movies or whatever that you're into, but it's kind of a representation of the intolerance and the hysteria that survived the religious practices of New England at the time. 20 women are killed. I believe it's actually a little bit less than that, but also 2 dogs, which seems mean-spirited. But the important thing about the Salem witch trials is it wasn't so much about witchcraft. It was about social status, in that many of the people, men and women, who were being accused of witchcraft in and around Salem were the haves, if you will. They were people of status. And many times they were being accused by people who wanted their land, wanted to remove a rival from society. And so what you begin to see is kind of this battle of a class structure in New England. This is something that, obviously will not go away, and we'll talk about how this kind of narrative of social class fits into America and American history. But you really begin to see the kind of it in its infancy in the Salem witch trials.
All right, guys. So I'm going to just bring us home here. Okay, so kind of the last thing that the chapter talks about is Bacon's Rebellion. And so I'm not really going to go into the history of the Bacon's Rebellion so much because they do a pretty good job in American Yacht. But just some things to kind of take from Bacon's Rebellion. So again, this takes place in Virginia, kind of out in the frontier is where Bacon and his fellow rebels live, and they're kind of dissatisfied with what's going on in the coastal towns. And as far as government, they're not feeling that they're getting protection from Native Americans out on the frontier. The majority of economic opportunities are going towards the wealthy that live maybe in the frontier, but more in the coastal regions. And out on the frontier, we have people that were formerly indentured servants and a lot of poor folks that are just trying to kind of make a living, which, as we'll see later, when we get closer to the Civil War, the majority of the South is made up of these poor folks. And we have really rich, wealthy people that have a lot of slaves, but the majority of Southerners don't have slaves. The majority of Southerners are just, people just trying to make a living like everyone else. And so what Bacon's Rebellion really highlights is kind of the differences between the social structures within the South. And we see income disparity between the haves and the have-nots, and some of that growing tension that we're going to see play out later. And another aspect from Bacon's Rebellion is we also see how the government in Virginia along the coastal regions was really able to kind of quell or get rid of internal rebellion or riots or dissent. And that's going to be significant because it's going to show that these budding governments are going to be able to control the population in ways that might not be so democratic. Another thing that Bacon's Rebellion shows is that the instability of relying on the poor, relying on indentured servants for labor. And so Bacon's Rebellion, one thing that it really does is it really strengthens the institution of slavery because slaves are viewed as more manipulatable. They can be controlled more. And so we really start to see a shift after Bacon's Rebellion towards more slavery. So that's where we're going to leave it today. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday. I feel like that was better. Dang, checking that is hard. I feel like we sound